Russia promises safe passage for civilians and then bombs them anyway. The West contemplates adding Russian oil to the sanctions list, and we get more clues as to the wide-ranging consequences that all of this might have, even as Russia lays out its demands. The deep dive videos on different topics will be resumed in due course, but for now the establishment of the new normal is still fast moving, so let's talk about that. Now, over the weekend we've seen supposed ceasefires to allow civilians to be evacuated and humanitarian supplies to be brought in, and they've been effectively fake, with pauses long enough to bring people out before shelling begins again. So, for example, evacuations to bring around 200,000 civilians out of Mariupol were supposed to start at noon on Sunday during a ceasefire from 10 a.m. to 9 p.m. But the convoy was unable to leave because of a renewed Russian assault, according to the Ukraine authorities and confirmed by the International Red Cross. This followed a similar process on the Saturday. Numerous commentators have noted that agreeing ceasefires and then ignoring them is a strategy that the Russian military have typically used in previous conflicts in Syria and in Chechnya. The aim is to devastate morale and to make the population more likely to surrender. In principle, such behaviour is held to be a war crime, which is an interesting theoretical point of little value, as there seems to be no mechanism currently to hold these people to account. What it has done is to provide more human stories to shock the world and thereby to rally support. Because in these sorts of situations, the mainstream media focuses in on the individual human stories and tragedies, knowing that their audiences respond more strongly to those sorts of things than they can to the overwhelming mess of statistics and uncertainties in the fog of war. Over the weekend, the tragedy of a family of four hit the front pages of various newspapers and websites as the moment of a missile strike was caught on camera, which included the aftermath where a mother and two children were left dead with the father seriously injured, their luggage scattered all around them. This was from the town of Irpin, which is just outside the city limits of Kyiv. And Putin is just trolling the West at this point. Today, Russia published proposed new ceasefire corridors, which hilariously would take refugees not to somewhere like Poland or elsewhere in Ukraine, but instead to Russia and to Belarus. Weirdly, nobody was much attracted by the logic of that particular proposal. The UK government called it, quote, cynical beyond belief. At which point, Russia's chief negotiator said, hold my beer, and accused Ukraine of blocking the humanitarian corridors for civilians, and he called it a war crime. Russia also said today that it could stop operations at any point if Ukraine were to meet Russian conditions. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said that Ukraine must recognise Crimea as Russian, recognise Donetsk and Luhansk as independent states, and it must also amend its constitution and reject claims to enter any bloc, in other words, NATO or anything in the future that might look like NATO. Oh, and then Russia will finish the, quote, demilitarization of Ukraine. He insisted that Russia is not seeking to make any further territorial claims on Ukraine. I guess if you stripped a country of all its defences and required them on pain of renewed attack against their defenceless country to avoid alliances with anyone else, you might feel that you didn't need any further claims. But the point is, nobody would believe a country that said it definitely wasn't planning to invade in the first place, and it definitely would provide safe humanitarian corridors, and so on, going back through history. And the country that's now saying that there were biolabs in Ukraine, commissioned by the Pentagon of all things. I mean, probably tomorrow it'll be that, I don't know, COVID-19 started from a lab leak from one of them. There's a phrase in Russian which literally translates into make a good face on a bad game, which is intended to describe a process whereby you know you're lying, You know they know you're lying, and you simply keep a straight face and tell the lie anyway. Elliot Higgins of Bellingcat described it when they came across it in the project to establish the truth about who shot down the passenger airline MH17. It's taken as an expression of power, the ability to assert with impunity that which everyone knows to be untrue, but they are challenged to accept the unreality of it regardless. In the meantime, having dismayed the Ukrainians by repeating the impossibility of enforcing a no-fly zone, the West is looking for other ways to tighten the screws on Moscow and is reportedly now seriously considering extending its sanctions to Russian energy. This has been the huge gaping hole in the otherwise far-reaching sanctions that we're seeing the West continuing to provide Russia with billions of dollars and euros in order to get Russian gas and oil. It was held that to cut off that flow would be too damaging to the Western countries themselves, and so it would be a step too far, although they had to try to prepare themselves should Putin decide to cut them off himself. Now the Biden administration has said that it is in active discussions with European allies about banning Russian oil imports. The news that such a thing was even being discussed led the oil price to leap by up to nearly 20%, hitting the highest point it had been since 2008 before falling slightly back. Oil and gas accounts for more than half of Russia's pre-conflict exports, and if it came to pass, such a move would have a major impact on its economy. But while energy prices have been spiralling worldwide and in Europe in particular, there would be very significant costs added to that very difficult mix. Russian oil exports account for only 8% of the US market, as opposed to 25% of the European one at around 3 million barrels per day. The concern is also that if such a measure was taken on Russian oil, Russia might retaliate by choking off the supply of Russian gas, an action that would have a much more dramatic impact in Europe. Europe gets 40% of its gas from Russia, and that's an average, of course. For some of the smaller states, such as Latvia, Finland, Moldova, North Macedonia, that figure is somewhere between 93 and 100%, according to Statistica. This is the transmission system of the Russian gas across Europe. Indeed, the possibility of such a consequence saw natural gas contract prices for Europe shoot up by 50% just today. So it's easy to make broad rhetorical gestures, but unpicking that in practice is difficult with major consequences. Well, major consequences are likely to define the coming decade, so you should count nothing out. At his daily briefing today, President Zelensky called upon the West to boycott oil and oil products from Russia. Meanwhile, the plan to get fighter jets to the Ukrainians, along with other military aid, has been rather on again, off again. Most recently, we've heard that the US is urgently looking at supporting Poland to donate some of its MiG-29 jets, which the Ukrainian pilots are trained to fly, and then backfilling for Poland with alternatives from the US. The failure of the Russian military to achieve total air superiority has been one of the important factors in the slowness of their progress so far, so the MiGs might make a real contribution. That and the clear configuration of the Russian forces around the expectation of a rapid campaign with little resistance. The failure to achieve that has led to major logistical problems on the ground, fuel and food running out. While some Ukrainian supporters are celebrating the Russian missteps, hoping it might mean their victory is not certain and Ukraine could win the conflict, analysts are concerned that it could play out more badly this way. Putin may have blundered, but he has staked everything on this action. And if backed into a corner, which seems pretty much where he is, the expectation is that more violence, more heavy weaponry will be brought to bear. The shift from the first week, which rather avoided cities and populations, to the second week and beyond, which has seen them directly being targeted, rather illustrates the process in its potentially early stages. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians fight on regardless. President Zelensky survived a weekend, not to be taken for granted, and he reminded the US senators in a video call that it might well be the last time that they see him alive, according to Politico. The US Secretary of State Antony Blinken said that Ukraine has made plans to ensure that the government survives if President Zelensky should be killed. The Western governments have been discussing how to ensure that should Russia take the capital and install a puppet regime, which is the most likely outcome, there will remain an independent and internationally recognised government that can be the recipient of further support. And this requires some organisation because the Ukrainian constitution isn't especially clear on the issues of succession. And unsurprisingly, Ukraine is not keen to be super specific about what its plans are, given the likely consequences. And of course, those sorts of issues of succession for power can be extremely divisive, for all that Ukraine is apparently very much of one mind in its current course. Meanwhile, various people do their bit to help. Significant numbers of people are mobilised to help support the massive flood of refugees pouring out of the country, for instance. One person making his own contribution has been Elon Musk, whose SpaceX company announced that it was delaying its Starship program to focus on keeping internet service available to Ukraine in the face of Russian attacks. Musk had sent Ukraine a number of Starlink internet dishes to provide connectivity via his network of Starlink satellites. But the Russians haven't been content just to let that happen. Musk tweeted this: some Starlink terminals near conflict areas were being jammed for several hours. Our latest software update bypasses the jamming. I'm curious to see what's next. Zelensky has expressed his gratitude to Musk, noting that they were expecting a second consignment of terminals for destroyed cities. Back to the question of consequences. The boss of Yara International, one of the world's biggest fertilizer companies, said today that the war is going to hit the global food supply hard. Svein Tore Helseffer said fertilizer prices, which were already high because of the worldwide energy crisis, would soar significantly higher. Yara supplies more than 60 countries with fertilizer and gets considerable amounts of raw materials from Russia. Holseffer told the BBC, "For me, it's not whether we're moving into a global food crisis, it's how large the crisis will be." During the last week, as you might expect, various experts have been chewing over what we might be able to infer from all of this, what we think might happen next. Extremely knowledgeable people have disagreed on the topic of whether Putin is still a rational actor or not. Similarly knowledgeable people have disagreed over how likely it might be that there could be a coup at the Kremlin, with Putin being removed by people who, don't fancy his vision of becoming the next North Korea, maybe. They have disagreed about whether Ukraine will be a one-off, at least for now, versus those who think that he would move straight on to the next country in line. And all of this well-informed thrashing about is testament to one thing particularly. Putin has, since his time in the KGB, all the way through his public life, has done everything possible to hide from plain sight how he thinks, keep people confused and guessing about what he might do next, used as a weapon the fear that he might cross someone's red line tomorrow in a dramatic way. Or not, but entirely down to what he wishes to do. The truth is, we have no idea what he might do tomorrow or during the coming week, any more than we do about how it will all play out over the longer term. And that is exactly how he wants it. Right now, Ukraine, the West, everyone bar China, is in the position of reacting and responding to his initiative. He is moving to reset the world order in his favour, and everyone is looking at the obvious ways that they have to respond and asking themselves if they fancy bearing the costs of making those responses, versus, of course, the cost of not making those responses. And it could all be an illusion. The Soviet Union was to all outward appearances strong almost up until the point when it imploded. Unlike the sober bureaucrats of the Soviet era, Putin doesn't want you to be complacent about whether he might choose to smash up the furniture on the way out, if that's what happens. But at the same time, his position has lots of weaknesses. Yes, the propaganda in Russia works, and there is a percentage of the Russian population who believe all the stories and therefore strongly support what they've been told the action is. But the weakness is that what they're believing isn't true, to the degree where Moscow has had to ban all Western social media channels, all independent news outlets. From now on, its strategy is keeping the truth away from its own people. Just like China, just like North Korea. And it's one thing for them to impose that on people that have never really known anything else. Quite another on people that had experienced the wider world in all of its flawed glory before the doors were suddenly slammed shut. And you might get some sense of that in the news today, that in the Russian media it's being reported that Putin has signed a law to seize money from the bank accounts of officials in the event that the amount exceeds their expected income over 3 years, an anti-corruption measure. This would mean that the bank accounts of civil servants, as well as members of their families, could be checked at any time if they're found to have excessive funds that could only have come from corruption. That money will be seized and put into the state budget unless the officials concerned can prove its legality. You might consider that a surprising move from an institution known pretty much as a kleptocracy, where the corruption and enrichment of people is pretty standard. Analyst Olga Lautman suggested that this could well be a sign that Putin's making it clear to officials, all of whom probably could be caught by this law, should not think of becoming vocal or active in opposition to his wider actions. At least if they do, they should expect to be exposed as corrupt and have their money taken away. A master stroke of strength in the three-dimensional chess game of power? A sign of weakness, recognising the officials are getting rebellious? Only history is going to be able to make that judgment. Whatever happens in the next few days, the next few weeks, it is going to define the coming decade. And fatuous though it sounds to even say it, it's unlikely to be boring.